If you are really a police officer, prove it. Officer Ryan Keller's words cut through the late afternoon air, loud enough for everyone near the convenience store to hear. Officer Danielle Brooks stood 6 feet away beside her silver sedan, dressed in a navy blouse, dark slacks, and low black shoes, looking nothing like the criminal Keller seemed convinced he had found. Red and blue lights rolled across the wet pavement behind him, flashing against storefront windows and the faces of strangers who had stopped to watch. Danielle was 34 years old, a black woman who had worn a police badge for nearly 9 years, yet at that moment none of it seemed to matter. Keller saw no uniform, no marked cruiser, no badge displayed across her chest. He saw only the person standing in front of him, and somewhere between arriving at the parking lot and asking his first question, suspicion had hardened into certainty. Danielle kept her hands visible and her voice controlled. I already gave you my name, my department, and my identification information. Keller's jaw tightened. And I told you I need something I can verify. Then verify it. Her answer was calm, almost painfully calm. Imagine standing there while another officer, someone who had taken essentially the same oath you had taken, looked directly at you and decided your truth sounded like a lie. Danielle understood procedure. She understood officer safety. She understood why questions had to be asked. What she did not understand was why every answer she gave seemed to make Keller more suspicious. A middle-aged woman leaving the convenience store slowed near the entrance. A delivery driver remained beside his van. 2 people farther down the sidewalk watched without speaking. Danielle could feel their eyes. Keller reached toward the radio clipped near his shoulder. Dispatch, I need another unit at my location. Danielle studied his face. For what? Just stay where you are. I am standing exactly where you told me to stand. There was no anger in her voice, but something had changed. Keller heard it too. This was no longer a nervous citizen trying to convince an officer of something. Danielle spoke with the controlled precision of someone who knew exactly how these encounters were supposed to work. A second patrol vehicle turned into the parking lot. Sergeant Thomas Hale stepped out and approached slowly, looking first at Keller, then at Danielle. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she gave him her full name. Danielle Brooks, she repeated. Hale seemed to recognize something, but Keller continued before he could speak. She claims she is law enforcement. Claims. That single word settled over the scene heavier than the approaching evening clouds. Danielle looked from Hale back to Keller. For 9 years, she had learned that authority revealed character most clearly when nobody challenged it. Now she was watching that lesson unfold from the other side. Keller folded his arms. If what you are saying is true, this can end quickly. Danielle held his gaze for several silent seconds. Then she asked the question that would follow him long after that afternoon was over. Officer Keller, what exactly would make you believe me? 40 minutes earlier, Danielle Brooks had no reason to believe the afternoon would become anything more than another ordinary drive home. She had spent most of the day at department headquarters completing administrative work connected to a community outreach assignment, the kind of quiet responsibility that rarely earned attention but mattered deeply to her. Shortly after 4 o'clock, she closed the final report, exchanged a few words with a desk officer, and stepped into the locker area to change out of uniform. 9 years in law enforcement had taught Danielle that the uniform changed the way strangers looked at her. With the badge visible, doors opened faster, questions became shorter, and people often listened before she finished speaking. Without it, she was simply Danielle, a 34-year-old black woman trying to get through the rest of her day. She changed into a navy blouse, dark slacks, and low black shoes, placed her uniform inside a garment bag, and carried it to her silver sedan. Her department identification remained secured inside her wallet. She had nothing left on her schedule except picking up groceries, and getting home before the evening traffic became unbearable. The sky had turned gray while she worked, and a light rain had left the streets shining beneath traffic signals. Danielle drove nearly 4 miles toward the neighborhood market she visited several times a month. She stopped at a convenience store beside a small shopping center because she wanted coffee before continuing home. Inside, she greeted the cashier, waited behind an older customer, paid for a medium coffee, and thanked the clerk before walking outside. Nothing about those few minutes felt important. That was what would trouble her later. Life-changing moments rarely announced themselves. Sometimes they began with something as ordinary as opening a car door. Danielle had just placed her coffee in the cup holder when she noticed a marked patrol vehicle entering the parking lot. She glanced at it automatically, not from fear, but from habit. Police officers noticed police cars. She recognized the department markings immediately, although she could not see the driver clearly. The cruiser moved slowly past the storefront, continued toward the far end of the lot, then circled back. Danielle paused. Years of training had sharpened her ability to recognize when someone was observing rather than simply passing through. Still, she gave it little meaning. She checked a message on her phone, locked the screen, and reached toward the driver's door. Behind her, the patrol vehicle stopped. A door opened. Danielle heard footsteps crossing the damp pavement. "Ma'am, can I speak with you for a minute?" She turned and saw Officer Ryan Keller approaching. Danielle knew his face, although they had never worked closely together. Keller was assigned to patrol on the other side of the district, and their paths had crossed only briefly at department meetings. He gave no sign that he recognized her. Danielle looked at his expression, then at the cruiser behind him. Something in his posture told her this was not casual conversation. She set her coffee inside the car and faced him fully. "Of course, officer. What is this about?" Keller stopped several feet away. "We received a call about someone acting suspiciously in this parking lot." Danielle glanced around at shoppers pushing carts, employees leaving stores, and drivers moving between rows of parked cars. Then she looked back at him. "And you believe that person is me?" Keller did not answer immediately. That silence was the first moment Danielle understood that getting home on time was no longer going to be the hardest part of her evening. Ryan Keller had started that afternoon the same way he had started hundreds of patrol shifts before it, with a paper cup of coffee beside his computer and a quiet certainty that experience had taught him how to read people. At 43, Keller had spent more than 15 years in uniform, long enough to know every major intersection in the district, every shortcut around rush hour traffic, and many of the business owners who called the precinct when something felt wrong. Younger officers sometimes asked him how he could make decisions so quickly. Keller usually gave the same answer. "You learn to trust your instincts." To him, instinct was almost another piece of equipment, something earned through years of watching faces, hearing excuses, and arriving at scenes before all the facts were clear. But experience could become dangerous when confidence stopped leaving room for questions. Earlier that day, Sergeant Thomas Hale had watched Keller review a routine incident report and dismiss a witness statement after barely reading it. "You already decided what happened?" Hale asked. Keller leaned back in his chair. "I have seen this kind of thing 100 times. Hale looked at him for a moment. "Seeing something before does not mean you are seeing the same thing now." Keller smiled as if the warning were unnecessary. By late afternoon, he was back in his patrol vehicle, moving through the district beneath a gray Virginia sky. The rain had mostly stopped, leaving thin streams of water along the curb and a silver reflection across the pavement. His radio carried the ordinary rhythm of a weekday shift. A parking complaint, a minor traffic problem, a request for assistance several miles away. Then dispatch mentioned a suspicious person call near a convenience store and shopping center. The information was vague. An employee from a nearby business had reported someone lingering around parked vehicles and looking into cars. No confirmed crime. No clear description beyond dark clothing and an approximate location. Keller acknowledged the call and turned toward the shopping center. When he entered the lot, he slowed almost automatically. Shoppers crossed between vehicles. A delivery driver unloaded boxes. An older couple pushed a cart toward a sport utility vehicle. Then Keller noticed Danielle beside a silver sedan. She was looking down at her phone before placing something inside the car. Nothing about the movement itself established wrongdoing. Keller knew that. Yet his cruiser passed her once, and instead of continuing through the lot, he circled back. He watched her glance toward his patrol vehicle. That glance became meaningful in his mind. He saw awareness and interpreted it as nervousness. He saw her standing beside the sedan and wondered whether it belonged to her before checking. One assumption quietly invited another. By the time Keller stopped behind her, he was no longer asking whether she matched the caller's concern. He was looking for confirmation that she did. That difference was small enough to escape notice and powerful enough to shape everything that followed. Keller stepped from his cruiser and approached. Danielle turned toward him without hesitation. Her posture was relaxed. Her hands remained visible. Her first response was polite. None of those details reduced his suspicion. Minutes later, As she calmly explained that she was also a police officer, Keller did not hear information that deserved verification. He heard a story that challenged the conclusion he had already reached. And standing beneath the flashing lights in that damp parking lot, Danielle was beginning to realize that she was not simply answering Ryan Keller's questions. She was trying to overcome an answer he had chosen before he ever asked them. The call that brought Ryan Keller into the shopping center had sounded important only because one word carried more weight than all the others: suspicious. Dispatch had received the report at 4:17 in the afternoon from an employee working inside a business near the convenience store. The caller said someone had been lingering around parked vehicles and looking through windows, but the description offered little that could identify a specific person. Dark clothing. Adult. Somewhere near the west side of the parking lot. No vehicle had been reported damaged. Nothing had been reported missing. No one had claimed to witness a crime. It was exactly the kind of call that required observation before conclusion, something Keller had been taught years earlier and had repeated to younger officers himself. Yet when he saw Danielle standing beside her silver sedan, he began fitting ordinary details into the story already forming in his mind. Her glance toward his cruiser became awareness of police presence. Her phone became something she might be using to watch the area. Her pause beside the car became lingering. Even the fact that she remained calm when he approached seemed unusual to him. "How long have you been here?" Keller asked. Danielle looked toward the convenience store. "Maybe 10 minutes. I stopped for coffee." "Were you walking around the parking lot?" "I walked from the store to my car." Keller glanced at the silver sedan. "This is your vehicle?" Danielle nodded. "Yes." "Can you prove that?" The question caught her attention more than the others had. She looked at Keller carefully. "My registration is inside, and my driver's license has my name and address." Keller asked for identification. Danielle told him her wallet was inside her work bag on the front passenger seat and asked whether he wanted her to retrieve it. Keller instructed her to wait. She did. That should have mattered. She followed every direction without argument, kept her movements predictable, and answered each question clearly. But Keller's suspicion did not decrease. It simply changed shape. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked. Danielle held his gaze. "I am a police officer." Keller's expression barely moved, but his eyes narrowed. "With what department?" Danielle named the department they both served. For a second, she expected recognition. None came. "What precinct?" he asked. She answered. "Who is your supervisor?" Danielle gave him the name of her lieutenant. Keller stared at her, as if each correct answer created another problem instead of resolving one. Imagine telling someone the truth and watching that truth become evidence against you simply because it did not match the version of you they had already created. Danielle had interviewed enough people to recognize confirmation bias when she saw it. She had simply never expected to watch it unfold from this side of the badge. "You can verify everything I just told you through dispatch," she said. Keller glanced toward her car again. "We will get to that." Danielle's voice remained measured. "Why would we wait?" Keller looked back at her. "Because I am conducting this investigation." There it was. Not an explanation. A boundary. Danielle felt the first real weight of the encounter settle over her. She was not asking Keller to believe her because she wore a uniform. She was asking him to check information available within minutes. Yet he seemed more interested in preserving his suspicion than testing it. Across the parking lot, the convenience store clerk had stepped closer to the window. A delivery driver stood beside his van, watching quietly. Danielle noticed them and understood that this encounter was becoming public. Keller reached for his radio, then stopped before transmitting. "If you are really an officer," he said, "you should understand why I have to be careful." Danielle nodded slowly. "I understand being careful." Her eyes remained fixed on his. "What I do not understand is why careful only seems to mean doubting me." Danielle let the question hang between them for a moment, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood exactly what had changed. This was no longer a simple request for identification. She had given Keller her full name, her department, her precinct assignment, and the name of her lieutenant. Every detail could be checked through the same radio attached to his uniform. Yet Keller continued studying her as though accuracy itself had become suspicious. "Officer Keller," Danielle said, "my department identification is in my wallet, inside the work bag on the passenger seat. If you want me to retrieve it, tell me how you want me to proceed." Keller glanced through the passenger window, but did not move closer. "You said you work for this department?" Yes. How long? 9 years. And I have never seen you before. Danielle almost smiled at the logic, but there was nothing amusing about the situation. Their department employed hundreds of people across patrol, investigations, administration, community programs, and specialized assignments. No officer knew every face. We work different assignments, she said. That does not make me a stranger to the department. Keller shifted his attention toward the radio. Danielle expected him to call dispatch. Instead, he asked another question. What is your badge number? She gave it immediately. Keller's eyes returned to hers. Say it again. Danielle repeated the number without hesitation. A few feet away, rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the convenience store awning. Cars moved along the highway beyond the shopping center, their tires whispering across wet asphalt. The ordinary sounds made the moment feel even stranger. Danielle had asked civilians these same questions before. She knew what verification looked like when it was done properly. You collected information. You checked it. You adjusted your judgment when facts changed. You did not keep moving the finish line because the answer surprised you. You can confirm my badge number, she said. You can confirm my supervisor. You can confirm the vehicle registration. What exactly are we waiting for? Keller's expression hardened. We are waiting until I am satisfied that your story checks out. Your story. Danielle felt those two words more sharply than she expected. To Keller, her identity had become a claim requiring extraordinary proof. It is not a story, she said. It is information. Keller took a slow breath. People tell officers things that are not true every day. That is why we verify them. Danielle emphasized the word we, not aggressively, but deliberately. Keller noticed. His eyes narrowed again. You know a lot about procedure. Danielle looked at him in disbelief. I just told you. What? Across the lot, the delivery driver had stopped pretending to organize packages. The convenience store clerk stood behind the front window. Danielle could feel the encounter expanding beyond the two of them. She was being watched, not because anyone knew what she had done, but because flashing lights had already suggested that she must have done something. Keller finally lifted his radio. For one brief second, Danielle thought reason had caught up with suspicion. Then he requested a supervisor instead of verifying her credentials. Why are you calling a supervisor before checking my information? She asked. Keller lowered the radio. Because someone pretending to be law enforcement is a serious matter. Danielle stared at him. There it was. The possibility had become an accusation without evidence. She kept her voice level. And what happens when you find out I am telling the truth? Keller did not answer. Danielle looked at the badge on his chest, then back into his eyes. You keep asking me to prove who I am, she said quietly. At some point, you may have to explain why you were so determined not to believe me. By the time Sergeant Thomas Hale arrived, Danielle had answered so many questions that the original reason for the stop had almost disappeared. No one was asking whether she had actually looked into parked vehicles anymore. No one had identified a damaged car, a missing item, or a witness who could point to Danielle and say she had done anything wrong. The entire encounter had shifted toward one question. Was Danielle Brooks really who she said she was? Hale stepped from his patrol vehicle and approached with the cautious expression of a supervisor entering a situation he had not yet been briefed on. Keller met him halfway. She says she is one of ours, Keller said quietly, although not quietly enough. Danielle heard every word. Hale looked past him toward her. What is her name? Danielle Brooks. Something changed in Hale's face. It lasted less than a second, but Danielle saw it. Recognition, or perhaps the beginning of it. Keller continued before Hale could respond. She says she has been with the department 9 years. Claims she works out of Central Precinct. Claims again. Danielle stood beside her silver sedan, her coffee cooling inside the cup holder, while two uniformed officers discussed her identity as if she were not 6 feet away. The flashing lights reflected across the wet pavement. A few shoppers had stopped near the storefront. One man held his phone at chest level, apparently recording. Danielle noticed it and felt a familiar professional instinct telling her to remain calm, precise, and impossible to misrepresent. Sergeant Hale, she said. Hale turned toward her. My badge number is 4716. Lieutenant Karen Mitchell is my immediate supervisor. I completed annual qualification at the Westfield Training Facility last month, and my department identification is inside my vehicle. Officer Keller has had enough information to verify me for several minutes. Hale looked at Keller. Did you run the badge number? Keller hesitated. Not yet. Why not? I wanted a supervisor here first. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. For an identity check? Keller lowered his voice. Something about this does not feel right. Danielle heard that too. There it was again. Not evidence. Not a contradiction. A feeling. And every fact she offered was being forced to compete with it. Hale turned back toward Danielle. Officer Brooks, do you know me? I have seen you at command briefings. We have never worked the same shift. Hale nodded slowly. Danielle continued. You transferred from South District 18 months ago. Captain Lewis introduced you at the quarterly supervisors meeting. Hale's expression changed again. That detail was not secret, but it was specific enough to matter. Keller folded his arms. Anyone could learn department names. Danielle looked directly at him. Then verify mine. Her voice remained calm, but the patience beneath it was beginning to harden into something else. Not anger. Resolve. Imagine being required to prove yourself again and again while every proof is treated as another reason for suspicion. Danielle knew that if she raised her voice, Keller might call her aggressive. If she showed frustration, he might call her uncooperative. If she remained calm, he could call that suspicious too. It was a trap built entirely from interpretation. Hale reached for his radio. Dispatch. I need personnel verification on an officer Danielle Brooks. Badge number 4716. Keller looked toward him. For the first time since the encounter began, someone had finally asked the system a question instead of asking Danielle to defend herself. Static filled the brief silence. Danielle watched Keller's face while they waited. Then dispatch answered, and Hale's eyes slowly shifted toward him. Personnel records confirm an officer Danielle Brooks, badge number 4716, assigned to Central Precinct. The dispatcher's voice came through Hale's radio with the flat professionalism of someone who had no idea what those words had just done to the parking lot. Hale looked at Danielle. Then he looked at Keller. For several seconds, Keller said nothing. Danielle expected the tension to break. She expected a simple acknowledgement, perhaps an apology, perhaps even the awkward silence that followed an honest mistake. Instead, Keller reached for the one possibility that allowed his original judgment to survive. That confirms an officer with that name exists, he said. It does not confirm this is her. Hale stared at him. Ryan. The warning in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. Keller continued. If somebody knows enough about the department, they could use a real officer's information. Danielle felt something inside her settle. Until that moment, a small part of her had still believed Keller was being excessively cautious. Now she understood that caution was no longer the issue. The facts were changing, but his conclusion was not. Then compare my driver's license to the personnel record, Danielle said. Or let me retrieve my department identification exactly the way I offered 10 minutes ago. Keller glanced toward her car. Nobody is reaching into anything until we finish sorting this out. Then what evidence would satisfy you? Danielle asked. Keller did not answer. Hale stepped closer to him and lowered his voice, but Danielle could still hear. We have a matching name, matching badge number, matching assignment, and she named her supervisor correctly. What exactly are you seeing that I am not? Keller looked toward Danielle, then toward the small group of people watching from near the storefront. I am seeing someone who knew we were here before we approached her. Danielle almost could not believe what she had heard. I looked at a marked police cruiser entering a parking lot, she said. I am a police officer. Of course I noticed it. Keller's expression tightened. You are very focused on telling me how to do my job. Danielle held his gaze. Because you keep treating my knowledge of the job as evidence that I am lying about having it. The sentence landed differently this time. Hale looked down for a moment, as though replaying everything he had heard since arriving. The delivery driver remained beside his van. The man holding his phone continued recording. Through the convenience store window, the clerk watched without moving. Danielle knew what those people saw. Two white uniformed officers surrounding a black woman beside a car, while emergency lights flashed behind them. They did not know her badge number. They did not know her service record. They only knew what the scene suggested. That realization hurt more than Keller's questions. Danielle had spent 9 years telling community members that professionalism mattered, that procedure mattered, that officers had a responsibility to separate facts from assumptions. Now she was standing inside the very kind of moment she had spent years asking others to trust the system to handle correctly. Hale raised his radio again. Dispatch, contact Central Precinct and confirm Officer Brooks through the duty supervisor. I want a photograph and current assignment verification if available through department channels. Copy that, the dispatcher replied. Keller exhaled sharply. This is unnecessary. Hale turned toward him. No. What was unnecessary was letting this go this far without checking. For the first time, Keller had no immediate response. Danielle looked at Hale, then at the badge on Keller's chest. She did not feel victorious. She felt tired. Because if Keller needed this much proof to believe a fellow officer, she could not stop wondering what would have happened to someone standing in the same place without a badge number at all. The confirmation should have ended the encounter, but instead it exposed how far Keller was willing to go to protect his first impression. Hale kept the radio near his shoulder as dispatch continued. Central Precinct confirms Danielle Brooks, badge number 4716, 9 years of service. Current assignment is community operations. Lieutenant Karen Mitchell is listed as her supervisor. Hale closed his eyes for half a second, then looked directly at Keller. That is enough. Keller shifted his weight. We still have not visually confirmed that she is the officer in the record. Danielle stared at him, almost fascinated by the persistence of his doubt. Every answer had matched. Every detail had been verified. Yet instead of allowing evidence to change his judgment, Keller kept inventing another test. Hale spoke more firmly. Her identification is inside the vehicle. We can verify it safely and finish this. Keller looked toward Danielle's sedan. Fine. Hale turned to her. Officer Brooks, I want you to tell us exactly where the wallet is before you move. Danielle nodded. Black work bag on the front passenger seat. The wallet is in the inside zipper pocket. All right. Open the passenger door, retrieve the wallet, and keep your movements slow. Danielle followed every instruction exactly. She opened the door, lifted the bag into view, unzipped the pocket, and removed her wallet. She handed Hale her driver's license and department identification. Hale examined both, then looked at Danielle. The photograph matched. The name matched. The department seal matched. He handed the credentials to Keller. There. Keller studied them longer than necessary. Danielle watched his face, waiting for the moment when certainty would finally break. These look legitimate, he said. Hale's eyebrows rose. They are legitimate. Keller handed them back. I said they look legitimate. Danielle accepted the wallet from Hale and slowly placed it inside her bag. Something about Keller's wording made the entire parking lot feel colder. She had moved beyond proving her identity. Now she was being asked, without anyone saying it directly, to prove that reality itself deserved to be believed. Officer Keller, Danielle said, what information do you have that contradicts anything I have told you? He looked at her. We received a suspicious person call. Did the caller identify me? Not by name. Did the caller describe my vehicle? Keller paused. No. Did anyone report property missing? Not that we know of. Did anyone say they saw me enter another person's vehicle? Another pause. No. Danielle nodded slowly. Then what remains? Keller's expression tightened. You were in the area? Hale looked away, and that small movement said more than words. So were dozens of other people. Danielle glanced around the parking lot at shoppers, employees, families, and drivers moving through the same space. The difference was obvious, but she refused to say more than the facts required. Hale stepped between the conversation before Keller could continue. Ryan, this contact should be over. Keller looked at him. I want to speak with the original caller first. Danielle felt the last of her patience disappear, replaced by something quieter and stronger. Then speak with the caller, she said. But do not confuse investigating a report with trying to make me fit it. Hale turned toward her, clearly hearing the distinction. Keller did too. For the first time, the confidence in his face weakened. Then Hale's radio sounded again. The dispatcher had one more message from Central Precinct. Sergeant Hale, duty supervisor advises Officer Brooks was at headquarters until approximately 4 o'clock. Her current photograph has been confirmed against the identification information you provided. Hale looked at Keller. Now we are done. But Keller remained silent, staring at Danielle as the flashing lights crossed her face, and Danielle realized the most important question was no longer whether he believed who she was. It was whether he understood why he had needed so much proof. Hale had said the contact was over, but Keller remained beside his patrol vehicle, as if leaving the parking lot would mean admitting something he was not ready to admit. Danielle returned her wallet to the work bag and closed the passenger door. The rain had stopped completely now, and the clouds above the shopping center were beginning to break apart, allowing thin bands of evening light to stretch across the wet pavement. Hale stepped toward Keller. "Ryan, shut down your emergency lights. We are clearing this scene." Keller looked toward the convenience store. "I still want the caller's statement." "You can take it," Hale replied. "That does not require Officer Brooks to remain here." Danielle should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt unfinished. She looked toward the people who had watched the entire encounter and wondered what version of it they would carry home. They had seen flashing lights. They had seen two uniformed officers questioning a black woman beside a car. They had watched her identity challenged again and again. What they had not seen was anyone explain why it had happened. Keller walked several feet away with Hale, but their voices remained audible. "I followed up on a suspicious person call," Keller said. "That is my job." Hale answered carefully. "Following up was your job. Ignoring information because it did not fit your first impression was not." Keller shook his head. "You are making this bigger than it was." Danielle looked toward him. Those words finally pulled her into the conversation. "It was already bigger than you think." Keller turned. Danielle continued before he could respond. "You had my name, my badge number, my assignment, my supervisor. Dispatch confirmed all of it. Then you saw my department identification, and you still searched for another reason not to believe me." Keller's expression tightened. "I was being cautious." "Caution asks questions," Danielle said. "Bias decides what the answers mean before they are given." Hale said nothing. The sentence settled into the space between all three officers. Keller glanced toward the people watching and lowered his voice. "This is not the place for this conversation." Danielle nodded. "For once, we agree." She looked at Hale. "I want the entire contact documented. I want the dispatch audio preserved, and I want the body camera footage retained according to policy." Keller immediately looked at her. "You are filing a complaint?" "I am requesting documentation." Danielle's voice remained controlled. "What happens after that depends on what the record shows." Hale nodded. "That is reasonable." Keller exhaled and looked away. Danielle could see what he was thinking. A routine call had become paperwork, supervisory review, and questions from command staff. He still seemed to believe the problem was that the encounter had become complicated, not that his decisions had made it complicated. Hale stepped aside and quietly contacted the precinct. Danielle heard only fragments until he turned away from Keller and lowered his voice further. "Yes, Central Precinct. I need the duty commander notified. Officer Brooks is involved." He listened. His expression changed. "Understood." When Hale ended the call, he looked toward Danielle. "The duty commander wants the incident reviewed at the precinct tonight. He asked whether you would be willing to come in and give a statement while everything is fresh." Danielle looked at Keller. He seemed almost relieved, as though returning to the precinct restored familiar ground beneath his feet. "I will come in," she said. Keller nodded once. "Good. We can straighten this out there." Danielle met his eyes. "Officer Keller, I already know who I am. The question is whether the department wants to understand what happened here." 15 minutes later, Danielle followed Hale's patrol vehicle towards Central Precinct in her own silver sedan. Keller drove behind them. He believed the station would finally close the incident. He did not know Hale had made one additional call before leaving the parking lot, and he certainly did not know whose name had been mentioned on the other end. The drive to Central Precinct took less than 12 minutes, but for Danielle it felt long enough to replay the entire encounter from the beginning. The vague call, Keller circling the parking lot, the questions, the repeated verification. The moment her department identification had been placed directly in his hands, and somehow still had not been enough. By the time she parked beside Hale's patrol vehicle, evening had settled over the city. Fluorescent lights spilled from the precinct windows onto the damp sidewalk, and officers moved behind the glass doors with the familiar rhythm of shift change. Danielle had walked through that entrance hundreds of times. Tonight, it felt different. Hale met her near the lobby. Keller entered several steps behind them, carrying himself with the restrained confidence of a man who still believed procedure would reduce the afternoon to a misunderstanding. The duty commander, Captain Robert Lewis, was waiting in a conference room. He greeted Danielle first, then Hale and Keller. "I want separate statements," Lewis said. "Dispatch audio is being preserved. Body camera footage has already been flagged for retention." Keller nodded. "Captain, I can explain what happened." Lewis looked at him evenly. "You will have that opportunity." Danielle sat at one end of the table while Hale, remained near the door. She began recounting the timeline from the moment Keller approached her silver sedan. She gave times when she remembered them, repeated the questions she had been asked, and described each attempt she made to provide verifiable information. She did not exaggerate. She did not speculate about Keller's intentions. She simply described his decisions. That restraint made the account harder to dismiss. Across the hall, Keller gave his own statement. He emphasized caution, officer safety, and the suspicious person call. He described Danielle as unusually knowledgeable about department procedure, apparently without hearing how strange that sounded after her identity had been confirmed. Captain Lewis listened to both accounts, then reviewed the preliminary dispatch log. His expression became more serious with each timestamp. At 4:23, Danielle had provided her name. At 4:25, she had offered access to her identification. Verification had not been requested until Hale arrived several minutes later. Lewis leaned back in his chair. Why was her information not checked immediately? Keller answered, I believe there was a possibility she was impersonating an officer. Based on what? Lewis asked. Keller paused. The totality of the circumstances. Lewis waited. Which circumstances? Another pause. Keller looked toward the table. Before he could answer, Hale's phone vibrated. He stepped into the hallway and answered quietly. Sergeant Hale. A familiar voice responded from the other end. Police Chief Marcus Reed had been preparing for an evening command meeting when Hale's earlier message reached his office. He had known Danielle Brooks for years. He knew her service record, her community work, and the commendation she had received after helping redesign the department's neighborhood outreach program. But Hale had not called him because Danielle needed someone powerful to prove her worth. Hale had called because what happened in that parking lot raised a question larger than one officer's identity. Reed listened as Hale summarized the incident. Then the chief became silent. What was the officer's name? He asked. Ryan Keller. Another pause. And you said the woman he stopped was Danielle Brooks? Yes, Chief. Reed's voice changed. I am already in the building. Hale looked toward the end of the corridor. An elevator opened. Chief Marcus Reed stepped out, removed his reading glasses, and walked toward the conference room. Inside, Keller was still trying to explain why Danielle's answers had never seemed sufficient. He had no idea the next question would come from the one person in the department he could not dismiss. Chief Marcus Reed entered the conference room without raising his voice, and somehow that made everyone sit straighter. At 56, Reed had spent more than 3 decades in law enforcement, enough time to understand that authority was most revealing when it did not need to announce itself. Captain Lewis stood. Hale moved away from the doorway. Keller turned toward the chief and immediately began preparing an explanation. Reed stopped him with one raised hand. Not yet. His eyes moved to Danielle. Officer Brooks, are you all right? Danielle nodded. Yes, Chief. Reed knew her well enough to hear what the answer did not say. He had watched Danielle grow from a young patrol officer into one of the department's most trusted community officers. He knew her record. He knew her judgment. But he also knew that none of those facts should become a shortcut around the real issue. I have been briefed on the basics, Reed said. I want to hear how the decisions were made. Keller straightened. Chief, we received a suspicious person call. I located someone who appeared to match the limited information and conducted an investigative contact. Reed nodded once. What did the caller report? Someone lingering around vehicles and looking through windows. Did the caller identify Officer Brooks? No. Describe her vehicle? No. Report a theft? No. Reed's tone remained neutral. When did Officer Brooks tell you she was a police officer? Keller hesitated. Captain Lewis slid the dispatch timeline across the table. Approximately 4:23. Reed looked at Keller. And when did you request verification? Another silence. Hale answered quietly. I requested it after I arrived. Reed turned back to Keller. Why? Keller shifted in his chair. Her claim did not seem credible. What made it not credible? I had never seen her before. Reed looked toward Captain Lewis, then back at Keller. How many sworn officers work for this department? Keller knew where the question was going. Several hundred. Do you personally recognize every one of them? No, Chief. Reed nodded. Continue. Keller explained that Danielle knew department names and procedures, which made him consider the possibility that she was impersonating an officer. Reed listened without interrupting. Then he asked, when dispatch confirmed her name, badge number, assignment, and supervisor, what changed? Keller looked down briefly. I wanted visual confirmation. And when you received her department identification, I still believe caution was appropriate. Danielle remained silent at the other end of the table. This was different from the parking lot. No one was asking her to prove herself now. Reed was asking Keller to explain himself. That distinction changed the entire room. Imagine having every decision repeated back to you after the urgency is gone, when instinct can no longer hide behind flashing lights, and every assumption has to stand on its own. Reed leaned forward slightly. Officer Keller, I am not asking whether police officers should be careful. They should. I am asking why every fact that supported Officer Brooks became another reason for you to doubt her. Keller's face tightened. Chief, I did not know it was her. Reed's expression did not change. That is not an answer. Silence filled the room. Danielle watched Keller search for words. Reed finally turned toward her. Officer Brooks, tell me the part you believe matters most. Danielle considered the question. He had enough information to verify me early. He chose not to. And when the information came back in my favor, the standard changed. Reed nodded slowly. Then he looked at Keller again. We are going to review the recordings, the dispatch log, and the original call. But understand something before we do. His voice remained quiet. This review is not about whether Officer Brooks deserved professional treatment because she carries a badge. It is about whether you would have treated her fairly if she did not. No one answered Chief Reed immediately. His question had removed the safest explanation in the room. Keller could no longer hide behind the fact that Danielle was a police officer, because Reed had made something painfully clear. Her profession was not supposed to determine whether she deserved fairness. Captain Lewis opened the preserved dispatch log while Hale connected the body camera recording to the conference room monitor. Danielle remained seated at the far end of the table. She did not need to argue anymore. The record was about to speak for her. The footage began with Keller entering the shopping center. The original dispatch message played first. Suspicious person near parked vehicles. Dark clothing. Adult. No confirmed crime. No clear description of race, gender, height, or vehicle. Reed watched without comment. Then came Keller's first approach to Danielle. Her voice was calm. His questions were direct. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary. Then Danielle identified herself as an officer. The timestamp appeared on the screen. 4:23 in the afternoon. She gave her department, assignment, supervisor, and badge number. Reed looked toward Keller. When did you request verification? Captain Lewis checked the log. 4:31. 8 minutes. On paper, 8 minutes sounded small. In the recording, it felt much longer. 8 minutes of repeated questions. 8 minutes during which Danielle offered identification. 8 minutes during which Keller had immediate access to dispatch, but chose not to use it. The footage continued. Hale arrived. Verification came back. Keller questioned whether Danielle was really the officer in the personnel system. Her identification was retrieved. Keller examined it. Still, the encounter continued. Reed stopped the recording. Officer Keller, tell me what fact you learned during those minutes that increased the likelihood Officer Brooks had committed a crime. Keller stared at the darkened monitor. Nothing specific. Did the caller identify her? No. Did you locate a vehicle she had entered unlawfully? No. Did you find property belonging to someone else? No. Reed leaned back. Then what were you investigating by the end? Keller opened his mouth, but the answer did not come. Danielle watched him carefully. For the first time that evening, he looked less defensive than confused, as though he had finally reached the end of a road without remembering when he chose to take it. I thought I was being careful, he said. Reed nodded slowly. I believe you thought that. The word surprised everyone. Then Reed continued. That is exactly why this matters. Bias does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sounds like instinct. Sometimes it calls itself experience. Sometimes it tells you that one more question is reasonable, even after the facts have answered the last 5. Keller lowered his eyes. I did not know she was an officer when I approached her. Reed's voice remained calm. And if she had been a teacher, a nurse, a cashier, unemployed, would any of those answers have made unsupported suspicion acceptable? Silence. Danielle looked down at her hands. She had waited all afternoon for someone to understand that distinction. Reed turned to Captain Lewis. Place Officer Keller on administrative assignment, pending formal review. Preserve every recording and statement. Professional standards will handle the investigation from this point forward. Keller looked up. There was no public humiliation in Reed's voice, no satisfaction, No attempt to punish him in front of Danielle. Only procedure. Only accountability. Keller turned toward her. Danielle, I did not mean for this to happen. She met his eyes. Intent matters, she said quietly. But so does what you do when the facts tell you that your first judgment was wrong. Keller had no answer. Reed looked around the room. This department does not become fair because one of our own finally gets believed. We become fair when nobody has to carry a badge to be believed in the first place. 3 months later, Danielle Brooks walked through the same shopping center on a clear October morning, and for the first time since that afternoon, she did not hear flashing lights in her memory when she crossed the parking lot. The pavement was dry now. Maple leaves moved along the curb in the cool Virginia breeze. Customers carried coffee toward their cars, and the convenience store clerk recognized Danielle through the window and offered a quiet wave. She returned it with a small smile. Nothing about the place looked extraordinary, which was exactly what she wanted. The formal review had taken weeks. Professional standards examined the dispatch recordings, body camera footage, personnel verification timeline, witness statements, and Keller's written report. The findings did not claim that every question he asked had been improper. They focused instead on the pattern created when verified facts repeatedly failed to change his judgment. Keller was removed from field duties during the review and later reassigned, while completing additional training and performance requirements. Danielle had asked for accountability, not humiliation, and Chief Marcus Reed had made certain the process remained about standards rather than revenge. The department also changed its procedures. Officers responding to vague suspicious person calls were now required to document the specific behavior that justified extending an investigative contact, and supervisors were expected to review cases where identity verification contradicted an officer's initial assumptions. Reed knew policies could not erase bias from the human mind, but they could force decisions into the light where assumptions had to answer to facts. Danielle continued walking toward her silver sedan. She was dressed in a dark blue coat and black slacks, with her department identification secured inside her bag. No uniform, no visible badge, just a black woman crossing a parking lot. That detail mattered to her more now than it ever had before. Near the store entrance, Sergeant Hale approached carrying a cup of coffee. He had stopped there before his shift and smiled when he saw her. "You doing all right?" he asked. Danielle nodded. "Better." Hale glanced across the lot. "Keller asked me to tell you something if I saw you." Danielle waited. He said he finally understands why the question Chief Reed asked bothered him so much. Which question? Hale already knew she remembered. What if she was not an officer? Danielle looked toward the road beyond the shopping center. And what did he say? He said he did not have a good answer then. He is trying to have one now. Danielle absorbed that quietly. Redemption, she had learned, was not the same as forgiveness, and accountability was not the same as destruction. Sometimes change began when a person finally stopped defending the version of themselves they wanted to believe and started examining the choices they had actually made. Hale returned to his patrol vehicle. Danielle continued toward her car. Across the parking lot, another officer was speaking with an older man near a pickup truck. The conversation was calm. The officer listened, checked something through dispatch, then handed the man's identification back with a polite nod. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but Danielle stopped long enough to notice it. 3 months earlier, she had wondered what would happen to someone standing in her place without a badge number, a supervisor, or a police chief who knew her name. Now she understood that the answer could never depend on who that person turned out to be. Justice was not proven when powerful people received respect after their status became known. Justice began earlier, before the uniform, before the title, before anyone important stepped into the room. Danielle opened her car door and looked once more across the ordinary parking lot. Then she smiled faintly and drove away, carrying no need to prove who she was, because dignity had never belonged to the badge in the first place.